Kuridan, Bandom Diba Kuridan. I am the Bauridan, I am the Bauridan. Bandom Diba Kuridan, Bandom Diba Kuridan. Say your love give me fever. Anytime when you pass out the shiva. For your love I go fire bazooka. For your love I go enter the jota. Giving me your something, no. Baby need something, no. Giving me your something, no. Baby need something, no. Even though you the cook for my kitchen, even though you are washing my clothes, anytime you the see me.
Hello, and welcome to episode 13 of Afrikanists Assemble. After some interesting discussions in our monthly reading group concerning the teaching of African languages in the university setting, we decided to ride that momentum and ask our contributors what they thought about it. The question we asked was, what is your opinion on the state of African language teaching, and what is your utopian vision for it? Let's see what they had to say.
Vorrei iniziare dicendo che guardando indietro dovremmo essere fieri di quello che è oggi l'insegnamento delle lingue africane, rispetto ad epoche in cui lo studio di questa realtà era infatti solo appannaggio dei linguisti. Oggi è possibile per uno studente universitario medio acquisire rapidamente competenze in tanti idiomi del continente, Swahili, Hausa, Amarico, Somalo, Berbero. Ciò detto, resta evidente che i passi da fare sono ancora tanti, prima di tutto nella metodologia di insegnamento e nel materiale didattico. Lo studente che voglia apprendere l'inglese o il tedesco trova facilmente sul web centinaia di risorse, che lo renderebbero potenzialmente in grado di imparare la lingua da autodidatta. Lo studente di Swahili, al contrario, deve contare su manuali spesso incompleti e antiquati. Con le altre lingue africane purtroppo la situazione peggiora, urge quindi uno sforzo di ammodernamento dei materiali. La mia visione utopistica dell'insegnamento delle lingue africane parte dalla constatazione che esse sono sempre più presenti, anche nel territorio europeo, grazie all'immigrazione. Sarebbe bello sentire queste lingue parlate da tutti gli abitanti dell'Europa, vederle insegnate non solo all'università, ma anche nelle scuole, e perché no, imparate per strada, grazie a un'integrazione veramente costruttiva e reciproca. Io credo in un'integrazione in cui non è solo la comunità immigrata ad inserirsi nel modello sociale che trova, ma è anche la comunità ospitante che si lascia influenzare a nuovi apporti culturali. Quindi la mia visione utopistica è quella di un'Europa in cui tutti parlano qualche lingua europea e qualche lingua africana. Se la cosa può sembrare impossibile, va ricordato che il monolinguismo e l'associazione uno Stato, una nazione, una lingua è un caso particolare del contesto europeo. In Africa tutte le popolazioni sono state sempre esposte a più lingue e il plurilinguismo è sempre stata la situazione più comune. Quindi, perché non imparare dall'Africa?
I think one can be quite optimistic with the recent development on the state of African language teaching. Although many African languages are facing the danger of extinction, the attention they receive globally shows that researchers in African languages are growing more and more aware of the need to focus on the nature of these languages. In my opinion, there is need for a shift from the dominant grammar-based teaching to a more context-based, story-related way of teaching African languages. Here, I'm specifically expecting learners to be introduced to events and ideas imbued in the stories found among these languages and the peoples who speak them. The storylines and the accompanying ideas would help in the retention of the vocabularies. If I have to express any utopia, it is in the application of ICT in the teaching of African languages. This will trigger curiosity on the part of learners and ensure a reliable way of archiving resources for the study of African languages. There are thousands of exciting events taking place across African society that could be found on YouTube and other online platforms. They range from festivities to rituals to commerce and architectural designs, among others. When students are introduced to some of these, their curiosity to know and understand the events themselves would help in the internalization of the vocabularies and the grammar rules. The prospect of ICT is enormous. All the four language skills, listening, speaking, reading, and writing, could be incorporated in one lesson. In addition, ideas, history, and wisdom of the languages are also learned in the process. In essence, I subscribe to the view that the teaching of African languages should be more robust to enlighten and educate us on the history, nature, and prospect of these languages. We should go beyond the limits of grammar and the other prescriptive forms of teaching these languages. Learning languages should be accompanied by learning of history, identity, and philosophy of the people who speak them.
I'll start by qualifying my answer in the sense that I don't teach an African language or work on a campus where I can see such teaching going on right around me. But my opinion on the state of African language teaching generally, and certainly in the United States, is that the teaching in itself, the work in the classroom, is wonderful, and there is not nearly enough of it. I was fortunate in having the chance to study 2 African languages with phenomenal teachers, and that really changed my whole life. But in spending time as faculty at different universities and in looking around at campuses I visit, a pattern has been clear, one in which African languages are scarcely taught and in which there are generally 1 or 2 languages available, with others sometimes accessible on an as-needed basis, which means in practice that a student has to know in advance exactly why they need the language in order to study it, an arrangement that doesn't enable learning for discovery. In this pattern, too, the peripherality of African languages is communicated spatially. You have to hike to get there. African language offices or departments are often far from the center of campus, or in temporary or otherwise less desirable spaces like a trailer or a basement. A small number of institutions overturn this pattern. I wish there were many more. In my utopian vision, children would receive instruction in African languages from primary school onwards. This isn't so much so they would know African languages, but so they would know that there are African languages and have a tiny sense of what 1 or 2 of them might be like. Every secondary school student would have the option of taking an African language, and part of learning United States history from primary school onwards would be learning about the role of African languages in this country, about Gola, for example, and its connection to Sierra Leone's Creole. It would be routine for all colleges and universities to have departments of African languages teaching multiple African languages in different configurations from one institution to the next, and with different rationales for those configurations. The limits we have on African language offerings in the United States also mean there often isn't a lot of literature, that the courses stop before or just as you come to literary creation. In my utopian vision, this would change completely. We'd be spoiled for choice with a superabundance of courses in literature in African languages, available to us across our entire lives.
Mon opinion sur l'état de l'enseignement des langues africaines est que celui-ci connaît des fortunes diverses, et cela suivant les pays. Par exemple, l'on peut affirmer aujourd'hui que l'expérience d'enseignement du Kiswahili en Tanzanie est la mieux aboutie de toute l'Afrique, au regard de la littérature produite dans cette langue et aussi de l'importance quantitative des travaux scientifiques et de vulgarisation réalisés dans cette langue qui peuvent être considérés comme tributaires de son enseignement aussi bien en Tanzanie qu'ailleurs en Afrique et dans le monde. Par contre, en Afrique de l'Ouest, où l'enseignement se fait encore en langue française, l'enseignement des langues africaines, même dans les pays où certaines de ces langues ont de facto le statut de langue véhiculaire, comme le Wolof au Sénégal, l'expérience de leur enseignement est plutôt récente. Et dans les pays comme la Côte d'Ivoire, le Sénégal, le Togo, le Bénin et le Burkina Faso, cette expérience fait partie de l'initiative École et langue nationale en Afrique, en abrégé Élan Afrique, de l'Organisation internationale de la francophonie, un programme d'enseignement biplurilingue du français et des langues africaines dans les premières années du cycle primaire. À ma connaissance, ce programme, qui inclut également le Cameroun, le Burundi, Madagascar et la République démocratique du Congo, se trouve en ce moment à la fin de sa phase expérimentale. Dans mon pays, la République démocratique du Congo, j'avoue la mort dans l'âme que l'enseignement des langues nationales, quoique inscrite au programme de l'école primaire et de l'université, ne connaît pas le succès qui fut le sien avant l'indépendance du pays, faute de volonté politique et d'enseignants qualifiés, en particulier au cycle primaire. Pour l'avenir, j'encourage l'enseignement pratique des langues majeures d'Afrique et leur étude scientifique afin de prévenir leur disparition. Et j'invite les linguistes à les doter de terminologies capables de leur permettre de prendre en charge avec efficacité la communication dans les secteurs clés de la vie nationale.
The state of African language teaching is not quite encouraging, and this can be hinged on two main reasons. Firstly, the zeal to teach and learn indigenous languages is fast waning. You see, unlike before when the home was considered the first environment where the child comes in contact with native language, today most parents communicate more in foreign language, like English, with their children and wards in their earliest years. This is more pronounced in intertribal marriages or homes where the parents are from different ethnic backgrounds. And this is a common feature in a multilingual setting like Nigeria. It is sad to note that most parents who erroneously believe that to be civilization do not see the need to deliberately teach their young ones to read, write, and even speak in their mother tongue. Therefore, it is not surprising that the younger generation has little or no grasp of their native language. Secondly, there is the non-commitment of the government to adopt and sustain the teaching and learning of indigenous languages in their local communities. In Niger State, for example, which is my home state, the teaching of Nupe language in schools has over time suffered some setbacks because of certain governmental policies. A researcher in Nupe language, history and culture whose name is J.B. Adams in 2014 notes that Nupe language between the period of 1940 and 1967 was taught in church-owned schools and their Sunday schools throughout Nupe land until the takeover of such schools by the government that discouraged its continuity. Similarly, the adult education classes that were taught in Nupe by the defunct northern Nigerian government between the period of 1961 and 1969 was discontinued on account of the federal government creating new states. J.B. Adams holds that the program stopped because of state consciousness. But from the 1980s to date, fresh struggles were initiated by concerned individuals in Nupe land, notably Professor Jonathan Ndagi and Mr. J.B. Adams, amongst others. Such concerted efforts of promoting Nupe language in schools culminated in the inclusion of Nupe language as a course of study last year in Niger State College of Education. Well, it is believed that this development will be embraced by other higher institutions in the States. So what is my utopian vision for African language teaching? Well, it won't be out of place for the Nigerian government to come up with a policy on the use of indigenous language as a compulsory medium of instruction in schools, where it is used as the mother tongue of the community. This should be done especially within the first 6 years of the child in schools. To make this a success, the government should provide adequate funds, teachers, and educational materials. With this, I believe the state of African language teaching will be improved.
I think that we need to be offering more languages and pushing for more teachers who speak those languages as a mother language, or at least are completely fluent in those languages, to actually be teaching them. And my utopian vision would be to have a mixture of native language speakers for many more languages than we currently teach in the West. I can only speak from experience in Germany and in the UK about language teaching, that we should be pushing for more mother language speakers and more advertising for those languages. And we should be less concerned with the numbers of students that are wanting to learn those languages and be willing to offer those courses. That would be my utopia. Obviously, there is always going to be some pushback about viability of courses and whether or not they're profitable. I know that's been an issue in UK, especially with the privatized view of languages. But I think it's very important that students be able to learn languages that they want to and have a wide variety of choices. On top of that, I also think we should be trying to push for more exchanges where students can go and learn languages in the country where that language is spoken. I know that I have many students who spent a year learning a language. I myself am one of those students who now, if they were challenged to talk in that language, would not be able to, because whilst they were there for a year, they were learned it for a year and had some intensive courses, they were never given the opportunity to actually be immersed. And my utopian vision for language learning would involve sending students to have immersive courses where they're forced to speak the language, they're forced to see the culture and forced to actually embrace the language in a much more immersive way. And I think that immersion is key to that language learning. Obviously, that's going to be much more difficult to do with every single language and in a safe way, but that would be my ideal vision, is that we have students sent for immersion to these places and that we try and focus on communicability and making sure that students can understand the language, make themselves understood, and be less focused on ideas of grammar and being able to pass an exam. So yeah, I think we should be pushing for a wider variety of languages to be available, and we should also be funding more immersive schemes of teaching languages.
When I look at the state of African languages, I have the impression that a lot has not been touched yet. First of all, I start with the African continent itself. I would say a lot has not been exploited. This is because in many African countries, colonial languages are rather being promoted. And that's where we find it in educational milieux. As a matter of fact, some African languages are even banned in many African countries, which made the language or these languages being relegated to the back. If Africans themselves could pick up these languages to teach their citizens so that they could learn these languages, I think the state of the African languages will be better. I mean, that's my opinion about the African languages, kind of. And when I come back to the foreign universities, very recently I was having this discussion with some colleagues when I said, isn't it but normal that if we talk of African institutes, then we should have more of African languages being taught? This was just like a spontaneous thought that came up. Reading this question of the month, I was like, yeah, it makes some sense when we have more African languages being taught in African Institute. This also, if you look at it, in most African Institute of European universities, very few languages could be picked out and maybe taught, where in most cases I hear about Swahili, maybe Hausa, and maybe a series of other African languages. Yet, if we look at the African continent and how it is jam-packed by languages, we will see that there are still so many opportunities, still so many languages that the Institute could exploit or could make use of. In this case, there's also this chance of being able to employ the Africans to tell them stories themselves. You know, the saying that you can't tell someone's story better than the person. Maybe introducing these languages will be an opportunity to also bring some of those Africans to be able to tell their stories by themselves so that it could be better understood, something like that. So this is how I look at it. And I think their languages like Swahili, Lingala, and many other African languages, Igbo, that even Africans themselves might want to learn if they are based in Europe. And if these languages are being introduced, then I think the state of African language teaching is going to be highly improved.
The teaching of indigenous languages in Nigeria is currently in a poor state. Many factors are directly responsible. The factors include low status as well as prestige accorded to several indigenous languages in Nigeria, absence of clear language policy by the government, poor state of development of majority of the languages which still do not have orthography, poor funding and general lack of attention on language matters by the government, inadequate qualified teachers and resource persons, inadequate literature and teaching aids, improper curriculum, among other factors. One of the obvious impacts of the numerous challenges is the fact that a lot of young people do not consider a career in the discipline profitable and prestigious. This affects the teaching and learning of indigenous languages at all levels of education in Nigeria. At the higher education level, candidates who accept to study indigenous languages are often those who could not secure admission into their choice disciplines such as law, communication arts, English and literary studies. This fact has yielded to some innovations, though, in higher education in Nigeria as regards the discipline. Currently, there are some programs such as Communication Arts and African Language Studies, Linguistics and African Language Studies. The combination is an attempt to repackage and make the study of African languages more attractive. Well, someone may be curious to know why Nigeria, a country with luxuriant linguistic landscape, which is said to accommodate over 500 indigenous languages as well as cultures, will not pay adequate attention to a very important heritage. The conversation will be beyond the space available in this podcast. But it is worthy to note that despite the enumerated challenges, there are people within and outside the academia in Nigeria, in different global spaces, who have passionately and consistently promoted not just the teaching of indigenous languages in Nigeria, but general scholarship in African languages. My utopic vision is actually to see the teaching and general scholarship in indigenous languages in Nigeria become as luxuriant as the rich linguistic ecology. This can be achieved by a reorientation of the people to understand the significance of language. An aggressive but seductive advocacy campaign on the need to appreciate, support, and promote indigenous languages in Nigeria will, in no doubt, spiral into effective and robust teaching and learning of indigenous languages. Advocacy campaign for government to pay attention to language policy and language development matters. Advocacy campaign for parents to allow and encourage their children to study indigenous languages. Advocacy campaigns for government, philanthropists, corporate bodies, community groups to fund and support language development programs. Advocacy for experts to repackage the curriculum. Advocacy campaign is key. I strongly believe that to revive what goes on in the classroom, there is need to seriously engage the community.
When thinking about this question, I had in mind some very positive developments in second language acquisition in relation to African languages, such as the increased use of digital tools and media, and the recognition of the importance of translanguaging and multilingualism in a teaching context. However, at the same time, I could not avoid a certain feeling of isolation. Isolation in terms of definition. In some departments, African languages are listed under the label of small languages, although the number of speakers of that language is far from being small. Isolation in terms of investments to create contents and teaching material and pedagogical tools. And furthermore, isolation in terms of networks of university teachers. And so I asked myself, what would I desire to further African language teaching? Many things came to my mind, but I would mention two things which I consider urgent at the moment. Firstly, increased collaboration between the university where a language is taught and language research centers, especially those devoted to second language acquisition in the African continent. And secondly, the creation of frameworks, as for European languages, for example, to assess language acquisition. Such frameworks would structure language teaching at a transnational level and could thus sustain collaboration and exchanges between teachers and would enhance mobility programs of both students and instructors.
What is my opinion on the state of African language teaching? we must first clear the air on that. The African language teaching happens in many spaces, one within the formal sector and the informal sector. It is the formal sector that needs to be fixed, that needs a new vision, that needs new dreams. And the reason being that African language teaching has not been sold, and I mean offered to potential learners in a way that they would really love to want to learn the languages. What we have now are students who, by compulsion, have to learn the language, and graduate students that need to press it into service because they're going to do research in one African country or the other. But what if, just what if, it were possible to get students who are highly motivated, who think that it's a part of their civic duty to learn the language of another and do it in a way with love? My utopian vision of learning African languages, either in higher institutions, formally, or the community-based heritage African language learning institutions, especially for children who are born by parents who have not visited any of the African countries, but they live abroad. My vision is that African languages are ingrained in different subject areas. So we just don't learn it dry. We learn African language with theater, we learn it in the music department, we get into medicine, and we have a little unit, a little desk in medical schools where we can teach African languages based on the subject the students are learning. Apart from that, the culture goes with the language. And it's my vision that it will be possible for university authorities who have to go to any of these African countries to first stop in the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures to get a little debriefing, get a few words to go, so that they become models. And when they return, they let the university community know how helpful that little service has been. But what we have now is like African languages are just back burner issues. They are backboners and backbenchers that nobody ever thinks can be a steering wheel and not just a spare wheel. My vision is that someday, sometime, we will put African language learning in the forefront using all the means at our disposal. Thank you very much. Mo dúpẹ́ púpọ̀. Ẹ ṣé.
There are two cultures in Africa, the culture of birth and the culture of education. The culture of education is often the culture of dominance that possesses the language of a people. The language of education in school seems to be uppermost, while the language of instruction at home is relegated. This is due to their different relevance. The reason why the language of education seems to be uppermost is because it leads to certification and has the potency to open the window for gainful employment and social interaction across the continent. African language began to suffer threat at the inception of foreign education. At the moment, African language teaching is a second-place subject in school because the legacies are dependent on English provision. Sometimes, many African languages are taught in foreign languages. That is a discredit to the success of African language teaching in schools. On this account, the teaching of African language at home was overtaken because of the quest to learn the language that has economic and social value. In considering the utopian position, my take is that the teaching and learning of African language should begin in the family and community. This is because African language, like other languages, is residual on the culture of a people. Therefore, the sustenance of African culture is dependent on the viability of the language of the people. The community should therefore commission her people to teach pupils in primary and secondary their language in basic and high schools in addition to what is taught at home. The reading and writing skills of the language should be made competitive to learners and, of course, their teachers.
Growing up as a child in Plateau State, north central Nigeria, the Hausa and English language were the languages I deliberately learned how to speak, read, and write. The Hausa language enabled me to communicate with people I could not speak or understand their language. The Hausa, for the people of north central Nigeria or smaller ethnic groups, is like a lingua franca. English language, on the other hand, is for formal education, and by speaking and learning English language by all standards is learning the language of the elites. I have said this before on this platform that the policy of education in Nigeria allows teachers at primary school level to teach English and other subjects using the immediate language of the environment where they do not understand English. During my undergraduate days, I remember laughing at those studying Hausa, Igbo, and Yoruba because I felt they could not fit into any government institution apart from teaching, a job that has been bastardized. My utopian vision for African languages is to see it on equal footing or foot with English language. This is achievable when the government implements policies recommended by African language scholars that enables the African language scholars or students to work in any institution and earn as same as professionals or close to professionals like doctors and engineers. In essence, African language teaching has not been given the desired attention because it's still seen as an inferior course.
Penso che l'accademia, le università dovrebbero essere più ambiziose nell'offerta formativa che riguarda le lingue straniere, e africane in particolare. In molti centri linguistici si offre l'insegnamento della lingua sempre più improntato alla comunicazione e poco alla grammatica o alla morfologia. Se nell'immediato questo sembra portare a risultati apprezzabili, ritengo che non si tratti di una strategia funzionale nel medio e lungo periodo. Inoltre, credo che l'insegnamento della lingua, quando possibile, debba essere accompagnato a quella delle arti verbali, dei suoi testi, non solo perché questi offrono un vasto esempio delle possibilità espressive della lingua che si sta studiando, ma anche perché la letteratura offre la visione della complessità culturale, il suo divenire. Ciò può aiutare a superare una visione esotica e o paternalista della cultura che si sta studiando. Inoltre, le università non dovrebbero arretrare di fronte alla loro missione formativa. Offrire agli studenti strumenti disciplinari legati alla lingua di studio vuol dire rendere lo studente più indipendente. È vero che l'incontro con queste discipline, se non fanno parte direttamente del proprio piano di studi, può essere uno scontro. Tuttavia, uno scontro può essere produttivo. L'accomodamento non lo è mai. La mia visione, che non voglio credere utopica, ma sicuramente non realizzabile nell'immediato, è impartire nelle scuole europee superiori l'insegnamento delle lingue africane. È vero che il continente africano non è l'unico ad essere malnoto, ma è in gran lunga il più malnoto, e ancora oggi un razzismo endemico fa parte del nostro modo di vedere l'Africa. L'insegnamento di una lingua africana e della sua letteratura credo possa essere una campagna antirazzista efficace e che potrebbe portare risultati duraturi, perché si riconosce all'altro la capacità di insegnarci qualcosa, di condividere una parte della sua ricchezza culturale con noi. Questo studio potrebbe allenare i nostri studenti a leggere la complessità del reale, prospettive diverse da quelle europee e le diversità in generale. Questa è una risorsa per i cittadini che vivono in regimi democratici. Inoltre, l'opportunità di offrire agli europei lo studio di una lingua africana nasce da molteplici fattori. legami storici, artistici, economici, coloniali, le migrazioni. Ma basterebbe guardare una carta geografica per vedere com'è paradossale la nostra ignoranza nei confronti di un continente tanto vicino.
Those were all our contributions for this month. What do you think? Did they cover the subject of African language teaching well, or is there an aspect you think is important that got missed? Tell us in the comments below. Thanks so much for listening, and be sure to subscribe so you can see all our episodes.
Even though you the cook for my kitchen, even though you are washing my clothes, anytime you they see me they enter, oh my baby that one you